what I will do is add one more PLE to the ones that you have already said, which is bringing food and agriculture into the macroeconomic recovery plans. I think that's central, and it's something that we are missing today. Now, COVID-19 has come, as Laurent has explained, and all the day we have been hearing to exacerbate the situation and to make the crisis even worse. But what has happened in the macroeconomic world is very complex. This is the latest IMF outlook, which is even before the second wave that is happening in Europe of recession. So these numbers could even get worse. But basically what they are saying is that the global GDP growth will decline in minus 4.4%. And this is across the world, goes across all the regions of the world, the decline. It's the first crisis that is affecting the whole universe the whole world in terms of a recession. And this has deep consequences because everything is interlinked, as you well know, and that is what will affect all of us and will affect the next year and this year and potentially the following year in a deep recession that we need to fight, because we need to combine this recession with all the needs that we need to recover to be able to achieve SDG 1, 2, and SDG 10. Now, as I mentioned before, this graph is showing the real GDP growth annually. And as you can see, the recession today in 2020 is the deepest in 4 decades. It's deeper than the 2007-2008 recession. The blue line shows the advanced economies decreasing GDP growth. In real terms, the dashed yellow-orange line is the world, and the red line is emerging markets and developing economies. So this magnitude is tremendous, and this will have a significant effect over what will happen in the following years. If we look at the world and what will this mean in terms of how much of the output will be lost because of the pandemic compared to the pre-pandemic period, we see that we will lose in 2020 to 2021 $11 trillion. It's the size of one of the biggest developed economies in the world. $11 trillion will be lost relative to a pre-COVID-19 scenario. But not only that, between 2020 and 2025, the loss will be $28 trillion. So this is an enormous loss, and in economics, this is a sunk cost. It's already done. We already lose it. But we need to recover over this, and that's the big change that we need to do. Now, what is strange of this shock? And here the concept of trade-offs work perfectly. Because basically what we have is a health problem, the top graph, the number of cases increasing, this is the medical epic curves, and how the containment policies to be able to slower and to flatten that epic curve will create at the same time a problem in terms of economic recession, the bottom part of the chart. So the more effort countries were doing to reduce this bell curve of the epic curve, the bigger will be the recession because of the lockdowns and because of all the policies, the restrictive policies that had to be put in place to be able to achieve that. That is very different to other previous crises. And this is clearly a trade-off. Solving the health problem create a huge trade-off over the economic growth and economic development. And that's the complexity that we were facing in the macroeconomic world and in the day-to-day life of everybody of us. Now, what else was there? It was that the real interest rates were already too low. And that reduces an instrument for governments to do something, to do recovery. Normally, the central banks will lower interest rates to lend to the banks cheaper so that they can promote the economy. But we already were in a situation that the interest rates were already historically and unprecedentedly low. So the only option was to move from 0.1 to 0, not too much of a margin. And that reduced one of the most important instruments, monetary instruments you have to be able to reactivate economies. That was a big challenge, and a big challenge we are facing today. In addition, we saw a significant increase of the total debt in the world. This graph is showing the blue line, the total debt that we have as a percent of GDP in the world. Look, the enormous increase. Look at the private debt, has also been substantially increasing. And normally we don't take into account the private debt. But also look at the government debt, has also been increasing. And the situation is even worse if we just look at emerging economies and developing economies. And that again puts a huge constraint for them to be able to reactivate and to be able to improve and to be able to do a shift for a recovery. Here I am bringing some examples of governments: the United Kingdom, the US, China, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and how the government debt as a percentage of GDP growth has been increasing. Again, one more tool that restricts the capacity for the recovery, and which is in certain way explaining the low interest rates already there and the huge debt ratios, explaining why the recovery is not happening at the velocity we will have like it to happen. And what is the consequence of this? First, as we know, the World Bank is estimating that there will be an increase between 88 to 115 million people moving back to extreme poverty. We are losing more than 2 decades of reduction of extreme poverty. That's tremendous. And it varies region by region, but there are surprises like Latin America, where the numbers are growing because of the duration of the COVID-19. And in Asia, also the situation is getting worse. So this is not only a loss of global output, as I mentioned before, but also a loss of the welfare of human lives, which has been so much effort to be able to move them out of extreme poverty. They are all falling back into extreme poverty. And this is, of course, has its correlating undernourishment, our topic, SDG 2. Undernourishment, as we projected in the SOFI 2020 together with our partners, will grow between 83 to 132 million people. Again, we are losing a huge amount of effort to reduce that. And if we keep that trend, by 2030, we'll be in more than 900 million people undernourished. There is no way we will be able to achieve SDG 2 if we don't do a significant change. Now, one of the topics that we don't talk too much is of SDG 10, and this is inequality. And income inequality is rising in nearly half of the countries of the world before COVID-19. And this includes countries across the world, but also middle and low income countries. And COVID-19 is exacerbating this enormously. Just by looking at the differences between developed and undeveloped countries and the tools that developed countries could have to do a recovery versus what developing countries and emerging economies has, tell us how much inequality will grow. And even more, it will grow more within the countries. And that's a huge problem. That's the SDG 10. And that's why we are saying that we need to focus on SDG 1, 2, and 10. That's the only way we will have a sustainable solution to the problems we are facing. Now, what are the support measures? And here's what I am saying why inequality between countries will increase. Look at advanced economies. This is the level as a percentage of GDP that they are investing in other sectors and in health, the orange bar. Emerging economies, only 3.4, close to half, or less than half of what developed economies are investing. And look at low income countries, 1.4% of the GDP invested to the recovery. So these huge differences will have huge consequences for the future. And that's how we need to think differently, and that's why we need to change the way we are looking at things. Here, what I am bringing, the size of the fiscal stimulus packages for the G20 countries. Japan, 21.1% of the share of the GDP. Canada, 16.4%. Australia, 14%. United States, 13%. Turkey, 12%. Germany, 8.9%. China, 7%. Italy, 4.9%. Indonesia, 4.4%. Russia, 3.4%. Saudi Arabia, 3.4%. Mexico, 0.7%. Argentina, 6%. Look at these differences, this heterogeneity within the different size of the stimulus packages. And every stimulus package has a trade-off to the world. It's not for free. The money has a cost, and it will affect the countries. And we need to realize that, because at the end of the line, the global inflation is being pushed to the countries, and the devaluation and the exchange rate. So we need to be very careful with this. Now, what are the policies, instruments that countries are using today? Monetary and macroprudential policies is trying to make businesses to survive, and households and financial stability. The policy instruments, you can cut the interest rate to approximate zero because they were already too low, and you can do quantity easing to lower long-run interest rates and target access to central bank liquidity. Many central banks are giving money to banks to be able to lend with guarantees so that they can afford potential defaults. Fiscal policy, expansion of healthcare, survival of solvent businesses, and support to household incomes through the transfers. And this could be direct spending on healthcare, wage subsidies, loans to business, income support, deferred tax payments. And especially if you think on wages, go to a developing economy which is 60% or 70% informal. How do the government will be able to support them in wages if they don't earn wages? They are informal. And the combined fiscal and monetary policies. And basically here we can support the ability of governments to fund its policies. and joint business loans, directly funding monetary financing. Now, this is a tool that we have developed because we are very concerned that this could turn into a financial crisis. Because what is happening right now in the world is that central banks are supporting banks in developing countries by giving guarantees, and they are delaying the repayment. And that's very risky. And that we are observing across the world. So FAO has developed this tool to look at excess financing sector stock indices volatility. It's done with our big data group. And the red intensity tell us by country how volatile these stock indices are. And as you can see, many countries in the developing world is starting to have this excessive volatility. And that's a very bad signal. And that's something that we're tracking every day to see how things are evolving, because as soon as banks start to have problems, this is like a cascade effect that could create a significant problem to the financial markets. Exchange rate is something really important, and is directly linked to two things, to risk and to recovery plans. Why is linked to exchange rates, to risk? Because if you have too much of a risk in a country, capitals will move out. And as a result of that moving out of the capital, the dollar will depreciate in that country. And if the dollar depreciates, that means that you are more competitive in exports, but your imports are more costly. And your paying of the service of your debt is more costly. And what we observed in April 2020 at the beginning of the COVID-19 is huge depreciations. So again, more exports competitive, but more costly imports and more payment of debt. In October 2020, we observed some revaluation because countries start to gain confidence as a result of the potential vaccine and the improvements. And that's good for imports, cheaper imports for developing countries and cheaper payment of the debt. But what we are observing, if we follow this day by day, is that because of the uncertainty of the second wave, again, we are moving into exchange rate devaluation. And that affects even more developing countries. So this is something that we need to look very carefully, because it brings more uncertainty to the world. Now, the question always is, okay, how will we recover? Will this be a V recovery? Will this be a U recovery? Or will it be an L recovery? Now, no one knows really how it will be, but as months are going through, and despite the announcement of the vaccine, seems to us that we will be facing an L recovery. Meaning that we will be facing something like the UK, and not something like Germany in the previous crisis, where they have a WV recovery. And that means significant more risk to poor people, significant more potential consequences. So we need to be careful to try to change that L into a U recovery at least, so that we can recover faster. So this is for me, and I keep repeating this picture, but this is the situation we are. The big difference is that these animals, they know how to handle that risk. They know how to walk through these cliffs. We don't know. We have to learn, and we have to find ways to cope with risk. And that's what we are saying at FAO, and what the Director General keeps saying. We need to increase resilience of the food systems. And increasing resilience has two elements: minimize risks, vulnerabilities, and coping with risk when they occur, capabilities. We need to solve both of them. Minimizing risks, meaning to have better early warning systems, to be more prepared, to provide mechanisms to minimize zoonotic problems like we had today. Coping with risk is how we can subsist for the future once we have this shock, and how we can manage that shock. So FAO is working with 4 accelerators: big data, innovation, technology. Those can move very fast, and we're trying to move them very fast. And you have heard in the morning and in the afternoon how we're trying to bring the big wins. But if we don't take into account what we call the complements in our new strategy, which is governance, human capital, and institutions, those 3 accelerators won't be inclusive. This is when you grow, your economy keeps growing and increases inequality. We want to minimize that. We want to have growth with inclusion. And that's where we need to be careful. So it could be that initially those complements will decelerate the other 3, but that's what we need to make sure that in the future, those 3 will move very fast. So that's the combination of things that we're trying to push at FAO. So how we minimize risks? First, there is a need to increase investment in early warning systems and capacity to prevent those risks from recurring. We need to have predictive power so that people can know when things are going to happen. Second, the One Health approach as promoted by FAO, IE, and WHO. These are the topics that the DG has been pushing at the G20, and we have been pushing here today. And finally, we need to increase access to agricultural insurance, combining index-based insurance, traditional insurance, and access to finance. That combination, we know it works because it increased the pickup rate, and that's what we want to achieve today. This is what FAO is trying to do. We're trying to build with all our partners our situation room and trying to bring all our indicators of early warning together so that we can find ways in which we can increase our predictive power, working with the top agencies to try to come up with predictive power and have a situation room that is useful for the countries. But the second thing is how to cope with the risk and how we can link with the recovery plans. And here, this is extremely important because we are investing a lot of money in loans to countries to be able to do something. And budget support is not the solution because we need to use this as a catalytic investment. And there are 5 areas where we think this should do. First, of course, social protection mechanisms to support the poorest, taking into account nutrition as we mentioned before. Second, align incentives. Redirect subsidies on farm support from staples to high-value commodities. That's central. That's a big changer. Very difficult to do, but that's a big changer. Trade to boost farmers and productivity. We know trade will allow us to allocate better our resources. We need also to link value chain infrastructure to the financial systems. So it's not just building new bridges and new ports, it's linking that to the financial system so that we also create financial inclusion, as the Queen mentioned in the morning, the Queen from Netherlands. And finally, use technology wisely to support investment in digital innovations in food and agriculture. So on the first one, we did this analysis together with CEF for understanding what we can do. And we look at all the different types of investment that has been done in history. And we look at what will be the returns of those investments in terms of number of undernourished. And what we found is that there are some investments that could pay significant in terms of return, in terms of reducing undernourishment. So doing $1, the marginal return of that dollar in terms of undernourishment will be higher. Those are the bets where we need to put emphasis. And those are catalytic, because if we get those returns, then we can keep growing. And that's where we need to target. So investment of all these reactivation plans should include this priority setting, trying to see where the investments pay back more in terms of reduction of extreme poverty, in terms of reduction of undernourishment. And there is an investment mix that will reduce hunger with sustainability and with policy changes. And let me give you some examples of those investments. The first one, of course, is to scale up the food safety nets, and especially the cash transfers. That is needed, because if we affect the life of the people that are moving into extreme poverty right now, and we don't take care of them, the situation will be worse. And this is just to show the scale-up rate of cash transfers relative to pre-COVID periods. Look how much we have to scale up today, cash transfers across the countries of the world, to be able to achieve a situation similar to pre-COVID-19. This is a huge amount of investment that is needed. Again, how we link the recovery plans. Second, infrastructure. We know that road infrastructure will reduce undernourishment, and we also reduce inequality. We know that's a reality. But when we look at infrastructure, we also need to look at value chain infrastructure, because we need to look at storage to reduce losses. We need to look at market infrastructure, how we can bring technology to hang, to store, to processing, to invest in processing technologies, and everything, all these topics that we have heard today. That's the only way we will achieve what we are aiming to. And one thing which is important, and we will try to bring with this study, is that intermediate cities make sense to invest in there. Connecting rural areas with intermediate cities can give a huge payoff in terms of linking farmers and linking value chains to the bigger population centers, which are today those intermediate cities. So this is the case of Nigeria, for example, clearly where the intermediate cities are, which are the blue areas, are the areas where we can link the rural sectors to create that continuum between rural to urban that will allow us to have the highest returns to reduce inequality and to avoid migration from the extreme rural to the cities, to the big cities. Intermediate cities can play that role and can improve welfare across the countries, reducing inequality. Digital technologies, we have talked a lot today, but this is a study of the Broadband Commission, which basically shows that with at least 125 billion to a maximum of 2,100 billion, we can reduce the digital gap in the world. Each bar shows 3 scenarios: the minimum, the maximum, which is the blue, and the median, which is the circle. Now, let's assume that we operate with the median in Africa. We need $97 billion to reduce the digital divide. In the extreme, 139. Cannot we do that? Can the IFIs not use that money and create a fund for these countries to invest exclusively in eliminating the digital divide? I think there is a lot of options to do these things. We just need to put priorities. And IFIs need to think carefully, because by assigning funds which are specific to types of investments will help the countries to be able to pursue those and to get the highest returns. And finally, food loss and waste. The Director General mentioned this at the beginning. It has been mentioned across the day. Food loss and waste reduction have 3 wins: improve food security and nutrition, improve productivity, and reduce natural resource use and greenhouse emissions. What we are waiting for? This could create a huge change, and that's what we need to do. Thank you very much. And one of the things that I was trying to bring in this presentation is to try to alert that unless we don't link these programs with the recovery plans in the countries, which mostly are loans, in some cases soft loans, especially for IDA countries, with projects that will give the necessary returns, it will be very difficult that we can resolve the current situation. And I think the current situation is just starting. There is a lot that will come. What I have shown in terms of the level of recession we expect, it could be significant. Let me use the word, it could be brutal. And that's something that we need to be aware, and that's why we cannot lose time anymore. And I think that both Arif and David raised very important issues. No? First, on the human capital education, there is millions of people, of kids being affected because of COVID-19 in terms of access to education. The health services have all been focused on COVID-19 and they forgot about the vaccination. That will have huge consequences in the future. And of course, nutrition. Those 3 elements will affect, as David mentioned, in the future, all our human capital. On the other hand, what Arif was saying, conflict, climate, and so on, structural issues which are behind why we have so many countries in food crisis today, even before COVID-19. So these are issues that, for me, are linked to inequalities. There is no other reason why a rural poor person don't have access to things. It's because they are unequal. They are completely have less access to assets and have less access to resources, and are being excluded because of gender issues, are being excluded because they fall into this poverty trap that doesn't allow them to move out. So unless we do structural changes in the way we invest the resources, I don't think we are going to move out from this problem. The only thing COVID-19 is doing is saying, look, open your eyes. The situation is pretty bad, and it will continue to be bad unless you do a big change. There is a big effort, for example, now on vaccines that WHO is pursuing to try to create these accelerators so that everybody can have access to vaccine. I really hope they are able to raise the money to close the gap they have. But for the world, it doesn't make any sense anymore not to do those investments. I think COVID-19 has shown that if one country still has the problem, everybody else is at risk. And that needs to change the way we cooperate, the change we think multilaterally. And that's the core point of what I was trying to present. The difference just on the packages that developed countries are doing with what developing countries can do is enormous. And if developed countries don't realize that they need to change their way of thinking, we are not going to move out of this, and we are not going to resolve the problem. So for me, few countries really take seriously the issue of inequality. And we know that infrastructure reduces inequality. I have shown the numbers we need to reduce the digital divide. COVID-19 has shown that digitalization can be a huge opportunity. Of course, if you have good content and you have capabilities. Why we cannot create a fund to resolve that now? We have shown that with 14 billion, we can move 500 million people out of extreme of undernourishment by 2030. If we invest 14 billion every year, that's an incremental to the existing investment today. 25 more if we want to move to zero undernourishment. To create catalytic investment on some priority investments that many agencies, especially David and his team, has been working on this, and we have been also trying to do that. So why we don't make that change, and that structural change? I think is like the problem of food losses. No, we know the number, we know where it is, and we don't resolve it. So I think it's time to change. If not, the situation will be very dramatic in general structurally for the future and for all this human capital. So let's focus on priority interventions that will reduce inequality once and for all, so that we can be better within countries and between countries. Again, it's back up to data and information. The question is referring is to trade-offs. And that's where clarity has to be there. At least my belief is our goal as FAO is to achieve SDG 1, SDG 2, and SDG 10. That's what we want to achieve. And to achieve those goals, there are different pathways in which you can get into achieving those goals. There is not only one solution, and it will vary region by region, country by country. Each of those pathways, assume that we are in one country and we have 20 different pathways to achieve those goals, will have different trade-offs. And those trade-offs could be on soil, water, energy, biodiversity, and emissions, or income inequality or land inequality. And that's the work we are doing with David on modeling to try to identify those trade-offs and the magnitude of those trade-offs. Once you know those trade-offs, then you have to make a proper decision. How I minimize those, how I reduce those, so that I can achieve the goal with the minimum. And that's where all the other SDGs come to play a significant role. But if you don't have clarity on an objective function, then you will never arrive anywhere. You cannot have 20 objective functions at the same time or 10. You need to have one and see what are the trade-offs. Now, why is this so important? Because some of these trade-offs are global public goods, like climate, are not local. If I emit because I produce meat, I am affecting the environment globally. If I use my soil, I could be affecting locally and create a trade-off locally. So we need to differentiate what is global trade-off and what is a local trade-off. And for each of them, we could have alternatives to minimize those without necessarily transferring that true cost, that externality cost, to the consumer. Because today the consumer cannot afford healthy diets. So what if we assume and transfer more cost to them? Then it will be the situation worse. Now, what we know and what came out in the SOFI this year is that access to healthy diets reduce the environmental cost and reduce the non-communicable diseases cost. So again, it's a win-win situation. We are achieving a goal, SDG 2, we are improving the environment, and we are also reducing inequalities and poverty. So again, as long as we measure them, we can find solutions to them.